Welcome to episode 25 of my guide to video game history. In this episode we look at the PlayStation 2, the world's most successful console of all time, selling an unprecedented 150 million consoles over an 11-year production life. So sit back and enjoy as we go through this important console. In last episode we saw how in 1998 Sega released their new Dreamcast console, offering a new generation of gaming and wowing the world with its next-gen graphics and online gameplay. The following year, in March 1999, the Sony PlayStation 2 was officially announced by Sony in the Tokyo Concert Hall, and in May that year in E3 people would finally get to see the new device for the very first time, even if no games were playable. From that moment on it set the gaming world alight with its designer grown-up look and its impressive multimedia capabilities, being able to play DVD films, music and games in all one sleek black box. And it could still even play your PlayStation 1 games on the new device. Sony's media department also caused mass excitement through giving such outlandish hyperbole as terms such as the emotion engine that would produce graphics so good that finally we would feel emotions of the in-game characters. By February 2000 the hype had reached fever pitch, with playable games finally unveiled at the Sony's own event called PlayStation Festival 2000. And the games on show, particularly Onimusha, really impressed at the time. Such was the anticipation of the new console, it even started to cross over to non-gaming news, with the Newsweek publication this month even giving the impending launch a cover story, a first for any non-gaming national mainstream paper. So the following month, on the 4th of March 2000, the PlayStation 2 was finally released, and there was mass hysteria over this new device, with it selling 980,000 consoles in its first week, and this number was constrained by the machines available, so it's predicted that they could have sold 3 times that number, and it could have been even more. By the end of the month 1.4 million consoles had already been sold in Japan. So after so much hype about the machine, on launch the console's game lineup did little to impress, with many promised launch games being actually delayed, as developers were struggling with the new PlayStation 2 console, finding it difficult to program for. And for those games that were released at launch, they did little to impress, not harnessing the console's true power. Some of the best launch titles released at this time was Ridge Racer 5, a gorgeous looking update of that series, although not revolutionary gameplay wise, but still a good fun arcade racer. Then there was Street Fighter EX3, an average beat 'em up that was the third in the 3D series. To be honest, it looked quite uninspiring on the new console, in the graphics department feeling a bit rushed and glitchy. But although not a patch on the 2D Street Fighter games, it was still well received and popular on release. Kessen by Ko, meanwhile, simply looked gorgeous, and although the stripped down strategy wasn't to everyone's tastes, it did much to show what the console was capable of. The other titles in the launch lineup did little to excite, however, with such titles as Drum Mania, Stepping Selection, Eternal Ring and A-Train 6, hardly console-shattering titles. In summary, compared to the Dreamcast, Sega had won hands down at this point in the games department, with Dreamcast games looking so much better than the PlayStation 2 games. But it didn't matter, because DVD mania was beginning to take hold in Japan, and Sony's box was the cheapest way in. But by September 2000, things were finally starting to improve gameplay-wise, with the release of Onimusha Warlords, a hack-and-slash RPG that really impressed at the time, showing what Sony's new beast was capable of. October 26, 2000, Sony would release their console to the US for $299.99, and after so much hyperbole, it would cause a lot of salivating on launch day. The extra few months had also ensured that 26 titles would be available for gamers on launch in the US. But with such popularity and short supply of the console, it became a big seller on eBay, as people who could bought several consoles when available to them and then would sell it on eBay for $1,000, making a fortune in the process. The launch games for the US were even more impressive now that developers had had that little bit more time with the machine, with it not only having some of the Japanese launch games, but a stack of new titles as well. Highlights were Dead or Alive 2 by Tecmo, which alongside Tekken Tag Tournament by Namco did much to offer a compelling alternative to the sterling Dreamcast effort of Soul Calibur. There was also Dynasty Warriors 2 by A.K.A. Certainly this was a great showcase game, looking absolutely fantastic in the graphics department, with a huge number of foes to thwart on the screen at any one time. But gameplay wise it was quite repetitive, being simply a hack and slash nature of game, and so gamers soon got bored of it. SSX, or Snowboard Supercross, was perhaps one of the best launch titles, offering all that was great about such titles as 1080 Degrees, but offering it in a more stylized and lavish presentation that only EA can bring to the party. Another great launch title was called Time Splitters, and it was done by a newly created development house called Free Radical Design, who had been set up in 1999 by David Doak, after he and composer Graham Norgate had left Rare after the fabulous GoldenEye on the N64 game, and during the stressful development of Perfect Dark. For their new game, they stuck with what they knew, doing another first-person shooter, with much more emphasis on multiplayer deathmatches and story. This multiplayer emphasis may have upset some at the time, but it was done this way so they could turn around a game quickly enough for the PlayStation 2 launch. The title was great fun, and although not the prettiest game on the PS2, it was solid, fast and fun, and so it became a massive hit. Another two great launch titles for the PS2 was done by developer Angel Software, and they did two great games called Smuggler Run and Midnight Club Street Racing. Incidentally, both games were published by a new publisher called Rockstar Games, but I'll tell you more about this important publisher later on. Angel Software, incidentally, had already made a name for themselves with one of the first ever open city races called Midtown Madness on the PC back in 1999, and of course they're better known today as Rockstar San Diego, releasing such hits as Red Dead Revolver and Red Dead Redemption games. But for the PS2 launch titles, their first game they did was called Smuggler's Run. This game offered you an open-ended terrain for you to race around as you picked up and dropped off smuggled goods around a huge open map, offering unprecedented open terrain world for you to explore. The next Angel Studio launch title was the beginning of their long-running series with Midnight Club Street Racing. The game also was an open-ended city, but this time had you do illegal street racing across two cities, London and New York. And the game really impressed with its emphasis on having fun, with lots of secret racing shortcuts to find in the game. Over in Europe, the release date was set back from October the 29th 2000 to November the 24th 2000, and it sold for £299.99. But even with this delay, only 200,000 units were available for the region, resulting in a massive flurry of eBay selling again, with massive profits to be made as people sold on the console to people who were rich enough or desperate enough to want one for Christmas. But despite all the excitement over the machine, there'd yet to be a flagship heavy-hitting title to make gamers run to the machine, and anticipated titles such as RPG Dark Cloud and the scrolling brawler The Bouncer on release failed to live up to the hype, being huge disappointments. The first true AAA title for the console finally came out on the 28th of April 2001 with Gran Turismo A-Spec. It was released to much anticipation and excitement, taking Kazunori Yamauchi's excellent racing series to its third release, and although having only 180 cars in this game as opposed to the second game's 650, it didn't disappoint, with it having much more impressive handling and car modelling beyond any car game released at this time, and it's still the most critically rated and popular game in the seminal series. In Japan and Europe in 2002 there was an additional Gran Turismo game called Gran Turismo Concept, which allowed gamers to race in unreleased concept cars for the first time. It was a short but welcome addition, and even better, if you completed this you were given stacks of virtual money in the Gran Turismo 3 game, allowing you to finally buy every car. In June 2001 Mr. Mosquito was released. This was a delightful and unique game that had you play a mosquito who must drink the blood of the poor Yamada family who you've taken residence with. The game was a massive hit in Japan, and although it did poorly in other regions, it's well worth tracking down this unique, fun game if you can. The next highly anticipated release was Final Fantasy X, which came out on the 19th of July 2001 in Japan. The game didn't disappoint either, being a lavish affair costing $32.3 million and over 100 people working on the game. The new game would be the first in the series to have 3D rendered backgrounds as opposed to pre-rendered of the previous. Also, this game had full voice acting throughout the game for the very first time. The game was well received, with many publications marvelling at the engaging storyline and graphics, although there were magazines such as Edge that were more critical, giving the game only 6 out of 10, citing the game as too linear and had nauseating dialogue. Incidentally, a 10.2 version of the Final Fantasy game was released in 2003, offering a tandem storyline that was more fun and less somber than the Final Fantasy X game. In May 2002, Square would follow on with Final Fantasy XI. This was a bit of a departure from the norm, with it being a massively multiplayer online RPG, which was enjoyable and well received on release. But for the next installment with Final Fantasy XII, gamers would have to wait all the way until May 2006. But it was well worth the wait, with it being another major update in the series, with it having a glorious story for you to follow. Both Electronic Games Monthly and Edge gave the game 9 out of 10. In July 2001, little-known Finnish-based developer Remedy, who had only at this point released Death Rally in 1996, and are best known today for their Alan Wake game, would leap to centre stage this time with their second game, Max Payne, released in July 2001 on the PC, with ports being admirably handled by Rockstar's in-house developers to bring the games onto the various consoles of the time. In the game you play Max, a former police detective whose wife and baby daughter is killed by the mob, and he goes on a Punisher-like vigilante revenge quest to take down the mob single-handedly. The game was immense, with compelling adult storyline set to some fantastic John Woo stylized slow-down action sequences that made the game so unique to play for the time. The game would see a sequel in 2003 which extended the storyline even further, and incidentally Rockstar are currently working on a third game in the series that will hopefully be released in 2013. In August this year, Hideki Kamiya, who had helped create the first 2 Resident Evil games and better known today for his brilliant Viewful Joe games Okami and Bayonetta, but in 2001 he would begin another famous series called Devil May Cry. Starting out initially as a Resident Evil 4 game, they decided instead to create on a new game series with emphasis on cool, stylized combat that had you play Dante as you take on the legions of demons. The game was the first of its kind, and although perhaps a little repetitive, it was nevertheless an action fest fueled with eye candy that could not be beat. The series would continue in 2003 with a third called Dante's Awakening in 2005. Incidentally, a fourth was released on the new current gen systems. in 2008. But for gamers wanting uniqueness, it was without doubt the beautiful A.K.A. released in September 2001 that truly impressed. With its gorgeously stylized graphics and atmospheric game to play like never before. Designed by Fumito Ueda and Capcom veteran Koji Kado, who had worked on arcade hits for Capcom such as Bond's Adventure and Camel Tree, and went on to do the brilliant Ape Escape games. But for A.K.A. they would create a beautiful world where you attempt to escape from a ruined castle. What was so special about the game was that there was no dialogue or particularly strict storyline for you to follow, with no display information of health or anything to clutter the screen. All of it had been removed, leaving just yourself in this compelling world, and so it immersed you completely into the game's artistic beauty. A spiritual prequel called Shadow of the Colossus was released in October 2005 that maintained and improved on the beauty of the first game. Originally it was called Miko, a play on the word two in Japanese, but they would change the name to Shadow of Colossus at last minute. This time the game was even more beautiful, with you playing a young man who must explore the ruined landscape to take out 16 colossal enemies to bring back to life your sweetheart. I cannot express how stunning and immersive these two games are, and I for one am waiting with bated breath for the HD PlayStation 3 revamp of these two classic and often overlooked games, with it being released later in the year. And also, that's not enough, they're coming out with a third title in the series called The Last Guardian, which is scheduled for release next year in 2012. In September 2001, Silent Hill series would come to the PlayStation 2 with Silent Hill 2. The game had you play James Sunderland, who receives a letter from his dead wife enticing him to the town, Silent Hill. The game is the most terrifying in the long-running series, with the graphics being frighteningly atmospheric on the new PlayStation 2 hardware. The series continued in May 2003 with Silent Hill 3, following a teenager called Heather this time, who is drawn to the town from a nightmare she has. Next was Silent Hill 4, released in June 2004, which had you play Henry Townsend this time, who's locked in an apartment and discovers it has portals to other dimensions. The series has since continued on with 9 other games in the series, and although in truth many of the more recent iterations have lost their way from what made the originals so great.